The crash and first encounter. Jacob Winters never expected much from life anymore. Days bled into each other, marked only by the steady hum of engines and the faint smell of motor oil in his cluttered workshop. His days were spent restoring old cars, and his nights were quiet, spent alone under the stars, a stark contrast to the chaos he had known years ago. That evening, he was working late, the sun having dipped below the horizon hours before. The rhythmic creak of crickets and the occasional call of an owl were the only sounds breaking the silence. He wiped the sweat off his brow, leaning over the '67 Chevy's rusted engine, his thoughts drifting to memories he kept buried. With each turn of the wrench, he kept the noise in his mind at bay, focusing on the simple mechanics in front of him. Then, without warning, the night was split by a sudden burst of light. A brilliant, burning arc lit up the sky, leaving a street that trailed off somewhere beyond the dense woods surrounding his property. The ground beneath him shook with a deep rumble, and he felt it in his bones, a shockwave that rattled the walls of his workshop and sent tools clattering to the floor. He paused, his heart racing, his hands still on the wrench as he looked out the workshop window. The light had vanished, but a faint, smoky glow remained in the distance, somewhere deep within the trees. "What in the hell?" he muttered to himself. Old instincts from his military days flared up, urging him to investigate. Jacob grabbed a flashlight, tucked his hunting knife into his belt, and headed out the door. The cool night air hit him like a slap to the face, snapping him fully awake. He stood for a moment, taking in the unusual stillness that had settled over the woods. Even the crickets had gone silent. He moved forward cautiously, flashlight in hand, his steps deliberate and quiet. Branches snagged at his clothes as he made his way through the underbrush, but he pressed on, eyes fixed on the faint glow in the distance. The smell of scorched earth grew stronger as he drew nearer, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of something he couldn't quite place. As he approached the clearing, Jacob crouched low, letting the foliage shield him as he peered through the gaps. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. A sleek, metallic craft lay half-buried in the forest floor, smoke curling up from ruptured panels. The entire vessel seemed to pulse with a strange, iridescent glow, shifting colors like liquid metal. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen before, more advanced than any aircraft that should have been capable of reaching Earth. "Jesus," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible as he processed the impossibility of what lay before him. His mind raced, flipping through 1,000 questions without finding a single answer. A pained groan snapped him out of his daze. He scanned the area, and his eyes locked onto a figure sprawled just a few feet from the shattered cockpit. She, or at least he thought it was a she, was unmistakably alien. Her skin shimmered with an otherworldly green hue, patterned with intricate silver markings that seemed to catch the light in a way that made them glisten like frost. Her features were strikingly human, but the details, pointed ears, elongated limbs, marked her as something else entirely. The figure moaned again, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Jacob hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run, to pretend he hadn't seen any of this. But another part of him, deeper and stronger, held him rooted to the spot. He had seen too many lives lost, too many people left to suffer alone. This was different, sure, but he couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Steeling himself, he rose from his crouch and stepped into the clearing, hands raised in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. He kept his voice low and steady, moving slowly to avoid startling her. "Hey there, I'm not here to hurt you, just trying to help," he said. At the sound of his voice, her eyes fluttered open, focusing on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Her eyes were a vibrant shade of emerald, almost glowing in the dim light, and as they locked onto him, he saw fear mixed with something else, resignation, perhaps, or even defiance. She spoke, her voice soft and melodic, but the words were foreign, unintelligible. He watched as she struggled to lift herself, pain etched into every movement. Blood, a dark, strange color, seeped from a gash across her abdomen, staining the dirt beneath her. "Easy there," Jacob murmured, his tone gentle. He moved closer, slowly, watching her for any sign of panic. She was weak, her movements sluggish, but she did not recoil from him. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on him, studying him with an intensity that unsettled him. He knelt beside her, the harsh reality of her injury sinking in. "You're hurt bad," he said, knowing she likely couldn't understand him, but needing to fill the silence. "I can't leave you out here like this." Without waiting for her reaction, he reached out, motioning to the wound. Her gaze shifted to his hand, and for a brief moment she seemed to tense, but then she gave a small nod, as if surrendering to whatever fate awaited her. With a steadying breath, Jacob slipped his arms beneath her, surprised by how light she felt. Her body went rigid, and a small, choked sound escaped her as he lifted her, the pain evident on her face. He gritted his teeth, fighting back his own discomfort as he made his way back toward the cabin, the alien cradled in his arms. The walk felt longer than it had before, each step heavier as he carried her through the woods, his mind racing with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. By the time they reached the porch, he was drenched in sweat, his muscles burning from the exertion. He shouldered open the door and made his way to the small bedroom, laying her down as gently as he could on the bed. Jacob wasted no time, gathering what limited medical supplies he had, though he knew they were far from enough. He worked methodically, his hands moving with practiced ease as he cleaned and bandaged her wound. Her skin was cool to the touch, smooth like polished stone, but warm with a life that pulsed beneath the surface. As he worked, her eyes drifted open again, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and vulnerability. She spoke once more, her words soft, a question he couldn't understand, but felt deep within him. He glanced at her, a strange feeling settling in his chest. "I don't know what you're saying," he murmured, his tone gentle, "but you're safe here. I'm not gonna let anything happen to you." The alien's eyes filled with tears, shimmering like liquid silver as they traced down her cheeks. She whispered something, and though he couldn't understand the words, the meaning was unmistakable. She was grateful. Jacob found himself reaching out, taking her trembling hand in his, offering her a silent promise he wasn't sure he could keep but knew he had to try. "Rest," he said softly. "We'll figure this out." He stayed by her side as the night deepened, watching over her with a strange sense of protectiveness. In that quiet moment, Jacob realized he had stepped into something far greater than himself, a journey that would challenge everything he knew. And as he sat there, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of her breath, he felt a spark of life ignite within him, a feeling he thought he'd lost a long time ago. Unlikely allies. Morning light seeped through the worn blinds in Jacob's cabin, casting a soft glow across the room. Jacob blinked awake, the weight of the previous night pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. Memories flooded back, the crash, the alien woman lying injured on his bed, her emerald eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. He glanced over to find her watching him, her gaze as piercing as it had been in the clearing. She was sitting up now, supported by the pillow he had carefully tucked behind her. The wound on her abdomen was bandaged, though her face was still etched with pain. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, an unspoken tension filling the air. Jacob cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "How are you feeling?" he asked, unsure if she understood. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to decode his words. Slowly, she lifted her hand, touching the bandage with a slight wince before nodding, a small, thankful smile flickering across her lips. In that moment, Jacob felt a strange sense of pride. It was absurd, he knew. She was an alien, a stranger from a place he couldn't even fathom. But in caring for her, he had found purpose in something beyond himself, something he hadn't felt in years. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning her surroundings with the intensity of someone who knew what it was to be hunted. She touched the bandage again and then gestured toward her wound, murmuring something in her melodic, unearthly language. He shook his head, raising his hands to indicate he couldn't understand, and after a moment she sighed, biting her lip, as she tried to think of another way to communicate. Then she gestured to herself and spoke again, her voice soft but insistent. "Leora," she said, her emerald eyes locking onto his with a kind of urgency. "Leora," Jacob repeated, letting the name roll off his tongue. It felt alien, yet somehow fitting. She nodded, satisfied, and pointed to him, waiting expectantly. "Jacob," he said. "My name is Jacob." She tried to repeat it, her voice wrapping around the unfamiliar syllables until she managed a soft, almost perfect Jacob. A grin tugged at the corners of his mouth despite himself. It was the first time he'd heard his name spoken in what felt like ages, and something about hearing it from her mouth made it sound new. They sat in silence for a while, each adjusting to the strangeness of the other's presence. He reached for the jug of water by his bedside, filling a glass and handing it to her. She hesitated, eyeing it with uncertainty before taking a cautious sip. Relief softened her features, and she drank deeply, visibly grateful. A loud rumble broke the silence, causing Jacob to jump. She stared down at her stomach, looking almost embarrassed. Jacob chuckled, realizing she must be hungry. He gestured for her to wait, heading to his small kitchen, where he quickly threw together what little food he had: bread, some preserved meat, and a few overripe fruits he'd been meaning to toss. Carrying the makeshift meal back to the room, he placed it on the bedside table, gesturing for her to eat. She eyed the food cautiously, reaching out to sniff it before gingerly taking a bite. Her eyes widened as the flavor hit her, and she eagerly took another bite, her movements restrained but filled with genuine delight. "You like that, huh?" he murmured, watching her with a mix of amusement and fascination. She didn't answer, of course, but her eyes met his, and in them he saw a flicker of gratitude, a shared, wordless understanding. As she ate, Jacob felt the weight of curiosity building in his mind. Who was she? Why had she come to Earth, and more importantly, who was after her? He knew from experience that no one went through such lengths to escape without a powerful reason. He wanted to ask her, but he held back, afraid of breaking the tentative trust that was forming between them. But Leora seemed to sense his questions. She looked up from her meal, her expression shifting to one of somber contemplation. After a moment, she touched her chest, over her heart, and then pointed toward the sky, tracing her fingers in a wide arc. She paused, searching his face for comprehension, but Jacob only shook his head, struggling to piece together the fragments of her meaning. Her brows knit together as she tried again, gesturing to her wound, then pointing out the window, to the vast expanse of forest that lay beyond. Slowly, she drew her hand back to her heart, curling her fingers into a fist, as if capturing something precious and fragile. Jacob stared, his mind whirring as he connected the dots. She was on the run, protecting something or someone. The wound she bore was a mark of conflict, a reminder of a battle she hadn't chosen, but had been forced to endure. He felt an odd kinship with her in that moment. Though they came from different worlds, both literally and figuratively, they shared a burden, a past filled with hardship and scars that wouldn't fade. He knew what it was to carry pain, to be pursued by memories he'd rather leave behind. His eyes softened, and he placed a hand over his chest, mirroring her gesture, and then pointed out toward the sky. Leora's face lit up in understanding, a small, genuine smile breaking through her guarded expression. It was a fleeting moment of connection, but it felt like a bridge, fragile yet unbreakable, between two souls adrift. Suddenly, her smile faded, her eyes widening in alarm. She clutched his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve as she stared out the window. Jacob followed her gaze, but he saw only the quiet expanse of trees, their leaves swaying gently in the morning breeze. But then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic hum in the distance, growing louder, accompanied by a faint vibration in the floor beneath them. His heart pounded as his military instincts kicked in, and he moved to the window, straining to see the source of the disturbance. On the horizon he saw it, a dark, sleek vessel cutting through the sky, its shape sharp and ominous against the morning light. His stomach clenched with a sickening realization. Whoever was after Leora had tracked her here, and they were closing in fast. "Stay here," he said, his voice a low growl, though he knew she wouldn't understand. He turned to her, repeating the words, gesturing for her to stay hidden. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, sinking back onto the bed as he moved toward the door. Outside, the air was tense, thick with the anticipation of danger. Jacob scanned the skies, his mind racing. He had few options and even fewer resources, but he wasn't about to let some unknown force take her away without a fight. As he crouched behind a stack of firewood near the cabin, he saw the ship dip lower, slowing as it passed over the trees, its dark hull casting a shadow over the ground. Jacob's hand tightened around his hunting knife, the only weapon he had, but it felt small, insignificant against the threat looming above. The ship circled once, twice, as if searching, and then, without warning, a bright, pulsing light shot down from the vessel, sweeping across the trees. Jacob ducked, holding his breath as the beam moved closer, its light casting an eerie glow across the cabin's exterior. His mind raced. He couldn't let them find her. Somehow, he had to protect her, even if it meant putting himself in harm's way. The beam paused, flickering slightly, before retracting back to the ship, and he let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him as the vessel began to ascend, its search seemingly concluded, but he knew they'd be back. Whoever they were, they wouldn't stop until they had her. Jacob returned to the cabin, his face grim as he looked at Leora. She met his gaze, understanding in her eyes, and though they didn't speak, the message was clear. She wasn't safe here, and neither was he. They would have to move, find somewhere far from the prying eyes of those who hunted her. He knelt down, his voice low but steady as he spoke, even knowing she couldn't understand his words. "I'll keep you safe, Leora. No matter what it takes, you're not alone in this." Leora reached out, her fingers brushing against his, a silent affirmation of trust that bound them together in the face of the unknown. And as they prepared to leave the safety of the cabin, both understood that this journey would test them in ways neither could imagine. The forest refuge. Jacob moved quickly, packing the few essential supplies he had into an old, weather-beaten duffel bag. His mind raced with possibilities, weighing every option against the dangers they faced. The encounter with the alien vessel had changed everything. Their pursuers wouldn't give up, and hiding out in the cabin was no longer an option. Leora's life, and perhaps his own, depended on getting as far away from the crash site as possible. He glanced over at her, his chest tightening with a mixture of fear and determination. She stood by the door, her slender frame illuminated by the dim morning light that filtered through the cabin's single dust-covered window. Her expression was unreadable, her gaze distant as if recalling places far beyond this world, places she might never see again. "Ready?" he asked softly, and though she didn't understand the words, she seemed to sense his meaning. She nodded, a solemn look in her eyes as she clutched the thick blanket he had draped around her shoulders. Her injury was still fresh, and though he'd done his best to patch her up, she was far from fully healed. Every step was a painful reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the trees. They set off into the forest, the towering pines and sprawling oaks forming a natural barrier that sheltered them from prying eyes. Jacob moved with practiced ease, guiding Leora over roots and around patches of tangled underbrush, all the while listening for any signs of pursuit. The forest was his refuge, a place he knew as well as the lines etched into his hands. He'd spent years in these woods, but never had he felt their silence so acutely as he did now. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Leaves crunched softly beneath their feet, and occasionally the call of a distant bird broke the quiet. Leora's movements were careful, deliberate, her emerald skin almost blending with the dappled light that streamed through the leaves. Despite her injuries, she moved with a quiet grace that belied her weakened state, her eyes flicking from shadow to shadow as if searching for hidden dangers. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, neither of them daring to break the fragile peace that hung over the forest. Jacob stole glances at her now and then, his mind swirling with questions he couldn't begin to ask. Who was she really? What kind of life had she left behind? And most importantly, what kind of force was powerful enough to drive her to Earth, wounded and alone? As the sun climbed higher, casting a warm glow over the forest, they came upon a small clearing. Jacob slowed, scanning the area before deeming it safe enough to rest. He turned to Leora, motioning for her to sit on a fallen log, his eyes filled with concern. She lowered herself gingerly, wincing as she shifted her weight to favor her injured side. He knelt beside her, taking the canteen from his pack and offering it to her. She accepted it with a small nod, her fingers brushing against his as she took the container. The brief contact sent a jolt through him, a reminder of the unspoken connection that had formed between them in those quiet hours in the cavern. As she drank, her gaze wandered over the trees, her expression softening with a hint of wonder. It struck Jacob, then, just how different his world must seem to her. The towering trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves. It was all new, foreign, and yet beautiful in a way that even he had to admit took his breath away. For a moment, he let his guard down, the weight of their situation slipping away as he simply watched her take in the world around her. She turned to him, her eyes bright with curiosity, and pointed to a bird perched on a nearby branch. The creature tilted its head, watching them with mild interest before fluttering away, disappearing into the canopy above. Leora made a soft, musical sound, something close to laughter. The sound startled him, and he couldn't help but smile, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. In that moment, the forest wasn't a place of danger, but a place of peace, a refuge from the chaos that had upended their lives. But reality returned all too quickly. As the sound of distant rumbling echoed through the trees, Jacob's instincts kicked back into high gear. He motioned for her to stay low, his body tense as he scanned the horizon. The rumbling grew louder, unmistakable now, a low, ominous hum that vibrated through the ground. His stomach twisted in fear. They were closer than he'd thought. "We have to move," he murmured, the urgency in his voice apparent, even as she couldn't understand the words. Leora's expression shifted, her eyes wide with fear as she scrambled to her feet, gripping his arm for balance. He pulled her close, guiding her toward a narrow path that wound through the trees, a path only he knew. They slipped into the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth as they moved deeper into the forest. Jacob's heart pounded, each beat echoing the fear that coursed through his veins. He had survived countless battles, but this was different. This time he wasn't alone. Someone else's life depended on him, someone who had come to trust him in a way he hadn't expected. They traveled in silence, each step taking them further from the clearing and closer to the safety of the deeper woods. Jacob knew of a cave tucked away in a rocky hillside, a place he'd stumbled upon years ago during one of his solitary treks. It was hidden, almost invisible to the untrained eye, and he hoped it would be enough to shield them, at least for a little while. As they neared the hillside, he felt Leora's grip on his arm tighten, her fingers digging into his sleeve. He glanced back, his gaze meeting hers, and saw the fear etched into her face. She was breathing heavily, her skin pale beneath its green hue, and he realized with a pang of guilt that she was barely holding on. "Almost there," he said gently, offering her a reassuring smile. She didn't understand the words, but the warmth in his voice seemed to ease her fears, if only a little. They reached the cave just as the hum of the ship grew louder, and Jacob hurried her inside, guiding her to a spot near the back where they would be hidden from view. The cave was cool and dark, the air tinged with the faint scent of moss and damp earth. He could hear the steady drip of water somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic counterpoint to the pounding of his own heart. They huddled together in the shadows, their breaths shallow as they waited, listening to the ominous hum that filled the air outside. Jacob's hand found hers, and she squeezed it, her fingers trembling. He felt her pulse beneath his touch, a fragile, rhythmic beat that grounded him even as fear threatened to overwhelm him. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity as they waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the sliver of daylight at the cave's entrance. Finally, the hum began to fade, the sound growing distant as the ship moved away. Jacob exhaled slowly, his muscles unclenching as relief washed over him. He turned to Leora, his voice a whisper. "We're safe, for now." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite identify. Slowly, she raised her hand, pressing it to his chest over his heart, her fingers tracing a delicate, almost reverent path. Her touch sent a shiver through him, and he was acutely aware of the warmth of her hand, the softness of her skin. In her eyes he saw a depth of emotion that took him by surprise, a gratitude that went beyond words, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they now shared. He found himself reaching up, his hand covering hers as he gave her a small, reassuring nod. "We'll get through this," he murmured, his voice filled with a conviction he hadn't known he possessed. "I don't know how, but we will." They stayed like that for a while, their hands intertwined, each drawing strength from the other. In that quiet moment, hidden from the dangers of the world outside, they were no longer strangers, no longer alien and human. They were simply two souls bound together by fate, caught in a story that neither of them could have foreseen. When they finally released each other, the gravity of their journey settled over them once more. There would be more dangers ahead, more battles to fight, but for now they had each other, and that was enough. Together, they would face whatever came next, united by a bond that transcended words, a bond forged in the quiet spaces between fear and hope. Into the wilderness. The shadows grew long as dusk began to fall, casting an eerie glow over the dense forest that seemed to stretch on forever. Jacob and Leora had left the cave behind hours ago, making their way along a narrow trail that wound through the thick underbrush. The ship that had been searching for them had moved on, but Jacob knew they couldn't let their guard down. Every second spent resting was a second that could bring their pursuers closer. They moved silently, each step taken with cautious precision. Leora's footsteps faltered now and then, her face pale as she pushed through the pain of her injuries. Jacob kept a close eye on her, his hand at the ready to catch her if she stumbled. She was struggling, he could see that, but there was a resilience in her, a determination that mirrored his own. As the sky darkened, Jacob scanned their surroundings, searching for a place to set up camp. He knew they couldn't keep moving through the night, not in her condition. The forest was no place to be when the sun set. Predators roamed these woods, and the temperature could drop rapidly. He finally spotted a cluster of large rocks ahead, forming a natural alcove that offered some shelter from the elements. He led her to the makeshift shelter, helping her sit down with a gentleness that surprised even him. He dug through his pack, pulling out a small blanket and wrapping it around her shoulders. She gave him a grateful nod, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but filled with an unspoken gratitude that lingered in the air between them. Jacob settled beside her, his eyes drifting up to the night sky. The stars were starting to emerge, each one a tiny beacon against the inky darkness. He watched them in silence, his thoughts wandering to places he had long tried to forget. Memories of old battlefields, friends lost, choices made in the heat of survival, each one a reminder of the life he had left behind. Leora shifted beside him, her eyes also fixed on the stars. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant as if searching for something beyond the glittering constellations above. Slowly, she raised her hand, tracing a pattern in the air, her fingers moving with a delicate grace that made Jacob's heart ache. He could see the sadness in her eyes, the quiet longing that spoke of a life she might never return to. Without thinking, he reached out, his hand finding hers in the dim light. She looked at him, startled, but didn't pull away. Her fingers curled around his, her grip tentative yet firm, and for a moment, they sat like that, connected by a shared understanding that went beyond words. As the night deepened, Jacob pulled out a small fire starter from his pack, striking it until a few sparks ignited a small flame. The warmth was minimal, but it was enough to ward off the biting cold that settled over the forest. He arranged a few branches around the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows that danced across their faces. They shared what little food he had, a handful of dried jerky and a piece of stale bread. He broke the bread into small pieces, handing her one, and watched as she studied it curiously before taking a cautious bite. She chewed thoughtfully, her expression softening as the taste registered. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like a feast. A comfortable silence settled over them, the crackling of the fire the only sound breaking the quiet of the forest. Jacob leaned back, stretching his legs out and allowing himself a rare moment of relaxation. His gaze drifted to Leora, who was staring at the fire with a look of quiet contemplation. There was a vulnerability to her in that moment, a rawness that tugged at something deep within him. "Do you miss it?" he found himself asking, his voice barely above a whisper. Leora looked at him, her eyes widening slightly as if surprised by the question. She hesitated, and then nodded slowly, her gaze turning distant. She raised her hand to her chest, pressing it over her heart, and then pointed to the sky, a gesture that spoke of places far beyond his understanding. Jacob nodded, feeling a pang of sympathy. He knew what it was to miss something, to carry the weight of a life left behind. In the flickering light of the fire, she seemed almost ethereal, her green skin casting a soft glow that gave her an otherworldly beauty. Her gaze softened as she looked at him, her fingers tracing a faint pattern in the dirt between them. She spoke a single word, something in her language, melodic and unfamiliar, yet filled with an unmistakable warmth. Jacob met her gaze, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I wish I knew what you were saying," he murmured, his tone filled with a rare gentleness. She tilted her head, a hint of amusement in her eyes as she seemed to understand the sentiment, if not the words. Reaching out, she placed her hand on his chest, over his heart, her touch light and tentative. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. In that brief contact, he felt her gratitude, her vulnerability, and the trust she had placed in him, a trust that seemed as fragile as it was profound. They sat in silence, the warmth of the fire wrapping around them as they shared that quiet moment. But as the flames began to die down, Jacob knew it wouldn't last. He was keenly aware of the dangers that lay ahead, the relentless pursuit that would follow them no matter how far they ran. He didn't know what Leora was fleeing from, but whatever it was powerful enough to cross worlds in pursuit of her. The fire flickered out, leaving only the soft glow of the embers and the chill of the night air. Jacob shifted, his gaze lingering on Leora as she pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her breathing slow, and even as sleep began to claim her. He knew he should rest, but his mind refused to quiet. Thoughts of what lay ahead churned in his mind, mingling with a growing sense of protectiveness he couldn't explain. Hours passed, the silence of the forest broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft calls of night birds. Jacob sat awake, his gaze fixed on the horizon, watching for any sign of movement. He was used to the solitude, used to being alone with his thoughts, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't alone, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of that responsibility keenly. As dawn approached, he rose quietly, careful not to disturb Leora as he gathered his things. The sky was tinged with the soft hues of early morning, the world bathed in a gentle light that seemed almost surreal. He glanced down at her, his heart tightening at the sight of her peaceful expression, her features softened in sleep. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder before pulling back, hesitating. It felt strange, this urge to protect her, to shield her from a world that would likely never accept her. But it was there, undeniable, a quiet strength that he hadn't felt in years. When she stirred, her eyes fluttering open, he offered her a gentle smile, his voice a soft murmur. "It's time to go." She nodded, her expression somber as she pushed herself up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She looked at him, a question in her eyes, and he nodded, his gaze steady. Together, they packed up the remnants of their makeshift camp, the embers of the fire fading into ashes as they prepared to continue their journey. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, Jacob found himself struck by a quiet realization. He had spent years hiding from the world, burdened by memories that refused to fade, but now, with Leora by his side, he felt a strange sense of purpose. Their journey was uncertain, their path filled with danger, but he knew he would see it through to the end. They walked in silence, the sun rising higher, casting warm light over the forest as they moved forward, side by side. Whatever lay ahead, he was ready to face it, not for himself, but for her, for the promise they had shared in the quiet of the night, a promise to protect each other in a world that would never understand. And as they ventured further into the unknown, Jacob felt a glimmer of hope, a hope he had long thought lost, but that now burned bright within him, fueled by the quiet strength of the woman who walked beside him. The hidden path. The sun rose higher, casting dappled light through the thick canopy above as Jacob and Leora made their way deeper into the wilderness. The forest around them had changed, growing denser and darker, the trees twisting together in ways that blocked out much of the light. The air was damp and cool, thick with the scent of moss and earth, and the sounds of distant rustling suggested that they were not alone in these woods. Jacob led the way, his senses on high alert as he scanned the area for any sign of movement. He knew these woods well, but they had taken on a new ominous feeling, as though the very trees were watching them. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sent his heart racing, a constant reminder of the threat that pursued them. Behind him, Leora moved with cautious grace, her steps careful but deliberate. He could see the strain on her face, the effort it took to keep up, but she pushed forward without complaint, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. Her resilience amazed him. Though she was far from fully recovered, her determination was unwavering, and she had become more attuned to their environment, responding to even the slightest sounds with a sharp alertness that matched his own. The ground sloped upward, leading them toward a rocky outcropping that jutted out of the forest floor. Jacob paused, glancing back at Leora to make sure she was still following. She gave him a nod, her gaze steady, and he gestured for her to continue as he scrambled up the rocks, extending a hand to help her as she climbed. They reached the top, stopping to catch their breath. From here, they could see a narrow valley stretching out below, the trees parting to reveal a shimmering river that wound through the landscape like a silver thread. The sight was breathtaking, a momentary respite from the dangers that lay all around them. But the beauty was fleeting. Jacob's mind remained fixed on their predicament, and he turned his attention back to the path. The valley below would offer little cover, but he knew of a hidden trail along the cliffs that might keep them concealed. It was a dangerous route, one that required precision and agility, but it was their best chance at avoiding detection. He looked at Leora, his expression serious. "It's not going to be easy," he said, pointing toward the narrow trail that humped the cliffside. She didn't understand his words, but his tone and gesture were enough to convey the challenge ahead. She nodded, determination flickering in her emerald eyes. They moved cautiously along the trail, the rocky ledge crumbling beneath their feet with each step. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, and a steep drop on their left fell away into the valley below. Jacob went first, testing each step before signaling for Leora to follow. He could hear the scrape of her boots on the rock behind him, her breath coming in shallow, measured bursts as she focused on maintaining her balance. The trail wound along the cliffside for what felt like miles, the sun slowly dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows that crept across the rocks. As they reached a bend in the trail, Jacob stopped abruptly, his heart leaping into his throat as he caught sight of something in the valley below. A sleek, dark vessel hovered above the treetops, its metallic hull gleaming ominously in the fading light. Jacob's stomach clenched. Their pursuers hadn't given up. They were still searching, still tracking their every movement. He gestured for Leora to stay low, pressing his back against the rock as he watched the ship scan the valley below, its beam sweeping methodically over the landscape. Leora's gaze followed his, and he saw a flash of fear in her eyes as she watched the ship. She turned to him, her expression pleading, and he reached out, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "We'll get through this," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. He had no idea how long they could keep running or how much further they could go before their luck ran out. They waited in tense silence, holding their breath as the ship hovered above the valley. Minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, the vessel began to move, slowly drifting away, its searchlight disappearing as it moved toward the horizon. Jacob exhaled, his muscles relaxing as the ship vanished from view. He turned to Leora, his voice a quiet murmur. "We're safe for now," he said, and though she didn't understand the words, the relief in his tone seemed to ease her fears. They continued along the trail, the tension between them gradually easing as they left the valley behind. Night began to fall, and the forest grew darker, the shadows stretching long and deep as they searched for a place to rest. Jacob finally spotted a small, sheltered alcove beneath a rocky overhang, and they settled in, grateful for the cover it provided. Jacob gathered a few dry branches, arranging them in a small circle and striking his fire starter to ignite them. The flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow over their faces as they huddled close to the fire. Leora sat beside him, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, her eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and quiet determination. He handed her a piece of jerky, watching as she took a small bite, chewing thoughtfully. She seemed to be lost in thought, her gaze distant as she stared into the fire. He wanted to ask her about her life, about the world she had come from, but he knew there was little point. Language was a barrier neither of them could cross. But then, as if sensing his thoughts, she turned to him, her expression thoughtful. She touched her chest, pressing her hand over her heart, and then gestured to him, her eyes questioning. He realized she was asking about him, about his past. He hesitated, unsure of how to convey his story in a way she would understand. But then he raised his hand, mimicking her gesture as he pressed his palm over his heart, and then pointed to the distant horizon, his eyes reflecting the weight of memories he had tried so hard to bury. She watched him intently, her gaze softening as she seemed to understand the unspoken pain he carried. In that quiet moment, Jacob felt an unexpected connection, a bond that transcended words, a shared understanding that went beyond language. She reached out, her hand covering his, and he felt a surge of warmth, a quiet strength that grounded him in a way he hadn't felt in years. They sat together in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the stillness of the night. The forest around them was dark and quiet, the stars above shimmering like tiny beacons in the vast expanse of sky. Jacob leaned back, his gaze drifting to the heavens, his mind filled with thoughts of the journey they had yet to complete. As the fire began to die down, Leora lay back, her eyes growing heavy with sleep. Jacob pulled his jacket around her, watching as she drifted off, her breathing slow and steady. He knew they couldn't stay here long, but for now, he was content to sit beside her, to watch over her as she rested. He had spent so long running from his own past, from the pain and loss that had shaped his life, but here, in the quiet of the wilderness, he felt a strange sense of peace. Leora's presence had awakened something in him, a desire to protect, to nurture, to forge a path that went beyond survival. As dawn approached, casting a pale glow over the forest, Jacob rose quietly, careful not to wake her. He gathered their belongings, packing up the remnants of their camp as he prepared for the journey ahead. Leora stirred, blinking awake, and he offered her a small smile, his voice soft. "It's time to go." She nodded, her expression somber as she pushed herself up, the weariness of their journey etched into her face. Together, they set off into the forest, moving in silence as the sun rose higher, casting light over the path that lay before them. They walked for hours, the forest growing denser as they moved further into the wilderness. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls filling the silence between them. Jacob kept his gaze fixed on the path, his mind focused on the journey ahead, but he could feel Leora's presence beside him, a quiet strength that bolstered his resolve. As the day wore on, they reached a small clearing, the trees parting to reveal a river that wound through the landscape like a shimmering ribbon. The water was clear and cold, a welcome relief after the long hours of walking. Jacob knelt by the river's edge, cupping his hands to drink, and gestured for Leora to do the same. She followed his lead, taking a small sip, her expression softening as the cool water washed over her. They sat by the river for a while, the quiet of the forest wrapping around them like a blanket, a moment of peace in the midst of their harrowing journey. But as they prepared to continue, a faint, distant hum broke the silence, sending a chill down Jacob's spine. He turned, his heart racing as he scanned the horizon, his gaze fixed on the distant trees. Their pursuers were closing in, and he knew they couldn't keep running forever. But as he looked at Leora, at the quiet strength in her eyes, he felt a surge of determination, a fierce resolve to protect her no matter what. They were in this together, bound by a shared struggle, a shared purpose. And as they rose to continue their journey, Jacob knew that he would face whatever lay ahead, driven by a bond that went beyond survival, a bond forged in the depths of the wilderness, in the quiet spaces between fear and hope.